Quick question, are you mad at me?
Why?
Because the last time I came out, you leapt into my arms. And this time I just got a tiny...
Oh, no.
So,
Did I really leap into you?
Yeah.
Oh, I feel...
She built her entire brand on the phrase, "Be kind." For nearly 2 decades, Ellen DeGeneres was the safest name in daytime television, the host everyone wanted to sit across from, the comedian America trusted in their living rooms every afternoon. But something started shifting, quietly at first, then all at once. Celebrities who had appeared on her show stopped talking about her. Others went out of their way to avoid being associated with her entirely. And when people finally started asking why, the answers were more consistent than anyone expected. This is what was actually happening behind that famous smile. The staff that couldn't stay silent. The story that cracked everything open didn't come from a celebrity. It came from the people who worked for her every single day. In the summer of 2020, while the show was on a production break due to the pandemic, a wave of current and former employees began speaking to the press. What they described wasn't the occasional bad day or a difficult boss with high standards. It was something more systemic, a workplace where fear was common, where speaking up carried real consequences, and where the culture that had been built around one of television's most beloved personalities was, according to multiple accounts, the opposite of what the cameras showed. Former employees described being told not to speak to Ellen directly if they passed her in the hallways. Others said they were discouraged from making eye contact. People were let go, according to several accounts, for taking medical leave or for attending family funerals. One former producer described the atmosphere as one where you always felt like you were one wrong move away from being out. What made the story land so hard wasn't just the details, it was the volume. This wasn't one disgruntled employee with a grievance. It was dozens of people, across different roles and different years, describing the same environment. BuzzFeed News published an investigation in July of 2020, featuring accounts from dozens of former staff members. Warner Brothers, which produced the show, launched a formal investigation. 3 senior producers eventually left the show as a result. Ellen addressed it publicly when the show returned for its 18th season in September of 2020. She acknowledged that things had happened that shouldn't have, and she took responsibility for the culture of the show as its host and an executive producer. But the damage to her public image had already started, and it wasn't going to be undone by a season premiere monologue. What mattered about this story, and why it opened the door to everything else, is that it reframed how people looked at all the other incidents that had been quietly circulating for years. Things that had been dismissed as rumors or tabloid noise suddenly had a different weight. Because if this was what the workplace looked like, what did that mean about everything else people had been saying? Kathy Griffin and the thing about Joan Rivers. Kathy Griffin is not someone who holds back, which is exactly why what she said about Ellen DeGeneres is worth paying attention to, because she said it carefully. Griffin, who has spent most of her career in the specific business of making powerful people uncomfortable, has been open about the fact that her relationship with DeGeneres was never warm. But the more revealing part of what Griffin has said isn't about herself. It's about Joan Rivers. Rivers, who died in September of 2014, was one of the most influential comedians of her generation and one of the few women who had successfully built a long-term career in a space dominated by men. She and DeGeneres occupied the same general world, television, comedy, Hollywood, but by multiple accounts, DeGeneres never extended to Rivers the kind of platform or support that Rivers' career and legacy arguably warranted. Griffin described conversations she used to have with Rivers where they would check in with each other about whether DeGeneres had reached out, whether there had been an invitation to appear on the show, whether there had been any acknowledgement at all. According to Griffin, the answer was consistently no. And what Griffin said about that wasn't bitter. It was more disappointed. She made the point that DeGeneres had one of the most powerful platforms in daytime television, and that Rivers was exactly the kind of woman that platform could have celebrated. Rivers herself was not quiet about her feelings. She made pointed remarks about DeGeneres in interviews over the years, suggesting that DeGeneres could be selective about who she championed and who she kept at a distance. Coming from someone with Rivers' standing, that wasn't a small comment. Griffin also published a book in 2016 that included a passage widely understood to be about DeGeneres, describing a beloved daytime host with short blonde hair who allegedly had her removed from a backstage area at the Emmy Awards. DeGeneres reportedly called Griffin after the book came out. Griffin described the conversation as genuinely upsetting, not because it was hostile, but because she respected DeGeneres and hadn't expected the call to feel the way it did. The Joan Rivers thread matters because it points to something specific, a pattern of who DeGeneres chose to support and who she didn't, and the possibility that those choices had less to do with kindness than with calculation. What Caitlyn Jenner said, and what happened after. There are interviews that are uncomfortable to watch in the moment, and then there are interviews that get more uncomfortable every time you revisit them. The 2015 conversation between Ellen DeGeneres and Caitlyn Jenner falls into the second category. Jenner had come onto the show as part of a wave of high-profile press appearances following her public transition. The conversation covered significant ground, and most of it landed reasonably well. But when DeGeneres pushed Jenner on the question of same-sex marriage, things got complicated. Jenner, who had grown up with more conservative values, said that her position on marriage equality had evolved, but that she had started from a more traditional place. She framed it as a progression, something she had worked through and moved past. DeGeneres pressed her on it. The interview stayed civil, but the tension was visible. What happened afterward is the more revealing part. DeGeneres went on another program and publicly characterized Jenner's answer as judgmental, making the argument that someone asking for understanding and acceptance from the public couldn't simultaneously hold judgments about others. It was a pointed thing to say, and it was said in a public forum rather than privately. Jenner addressed the interview years later, and her account of it added a layer that hadn't been part of the original coverage. She said that DeGeneres had spoken with her before the taping and had specifically asked her to walk through the progression of her thinking on the marriage equality issue, framing it as a way to help audiences understand. Jenner said she did exactly that, and then found herself characterized on air as someone who wasn't fully supportive of the very community DeGeneres was part of. Whether that was a misunderstanding or something more deliberate is something only the two of them know. But Jenner's account of it, that she had been asked to share something personal and then had that sharing used against her, fit a pattern that other guests and former employees had described in different contexts. The game show moment that made people uncomfortable. Not every incident involving DeGeneres involved a public falling out or a media cycle. Some of them were smaller, the kind of thing that gets noticed and then quietly filed away, until enough of those small things accumulate and start to mean something. In 2019, DeGeneres ran a segment on her show that attracted a significant amount of criticism. The segment involved celebrities being surprised with difficult or embarrassing situations for the entertainment of the studio audience. The format wasn't new. Hidden camera and gotcha-style television had been around for decades. But the specific way some of these segments played out started drawing attention, particularly when guests appeared visibly uncomfortable and the discomfort was played for laughs. Critics pointed to a recurring tension in DeGeneres' brand, the insistence on kindness as a core value existing alongside content that sometimes put guests in positions they hadn't fully consented to, at least not in the way the segment ultimately played out. Former guests described feeling like the terms of their appearances weren't always what they had understood them to be going in. This wasn't an isolated critique. Similar observations had been made about the show's approach to interviewing celebrities on sensitive topics, pressing for details about personal lives, relationships, and private experiences in ways that guests occasionally found more invasive than they had expected from a show with DeGeneres' reputation. The cumulative effect of these moments was a growing disconnect between the show's stated values and what some people experienced as its actual approach. For casual viewers, the show was still the show. But for people paying closer attention, or for people who had been in that chair across from DeGeneres, something felt off in a way that was harder to dismiss. Mariah Carey and the question she should never have been asked. Some interviews become famous for what the host did right. This one became famous for the opposite reason. In 2008, Mariah Carey appeared on the Ellen DeGeneres show during a period when significant public speculation was circulating about whether she might be pregnant. Carey had not confirmed anything. She had not made any public statement. She was, by any reasonable standard, entitled to handle that information on her own timeline. DeGeneres brought champagne onto the set and offered it to Carey on camera, framing it as a celebratory gesture while making clear that the subtext was the pregnancy question. The implication was direct. If Carey declined the champagne, it would effectively confirm what she hadn't chosen to confirm. Carey was put in a position where any response revealed something she hadn't decided to share. Carey later confirmed that she had indeed been pregnant at the time, but that she miscarried shortly after. She was open in subsequent interviews about how she felt about the moment on DeGeneres' show, that she had been cornered, that it had been handled without regard for what she might have been going through privately, and that the loss she experienced afterward made the memory of that segment particularly painful. This incident, more than almost any other single moment, captured what critics of DeGeneres' approach had been pointing to. The "be kind" framing and the actual behavior in that interview were in direct conflict. Carey hadn't gone on the show to discuss her pregnancy. DeGeneres put her in a position where she had no clean way out, and did it with champagne and a smile. It resurfaced in 2020, alongside everything else that was coming out, and it hit differently the second time around. Dakota Johnson and the lie told on live television. This one is different because it happened on camera, in real time, and there is no ambiguity about what was said. In 2019, Dakota Johnson appeared on the Ellen DeGeneres show to promote a project. During the conversation, DeGeneres brought up the fact that she hadn't been invited to Johnson's birthday party, framing it as a light, playful grievance for the audience. Johnson pushed back immediately. She said DeGeneres had been invited. DeGeneres insisted she hadn't been. Johnson held firm, saying directly and clearly that DeGeneres had been invited and had simply not come. The exchange lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough. The audience could see that one of them was wrong, and Johnson's account, that the invitation had been extended and DeGeneres had declined, was later supported by people familiar with the situation. What made the moment significant wasn't just the factual question of who said what. It was what it revealed about the dynamic. Johnson, unlike many guests who might have backed down or softened the moment to avoid conflict on live television, didn't move. She was polite, but she was clear, and the contrast between her composure and DeGeneres' apparent discomfort with being contradicted publicly told its own story. The clip circulated widely after it aired. For a lot of people, it was the first time they had seen a guest hold their ground with DeGeneres on camera in that way. and the reaction to Johnson doing so was almost universally supportive. That reaction said something, not just about the specific incident, but about how ready people were to see someone not simply defer. The Kevin Hart situation and how DeGeneres handled it. In late 2018, Kevin Hart stepped down from hosting the Academy Awards after past homophobic tweets resurfaced. The decision came quickly, under significant public pressure, and Hart initially declined to apologize for the old posts before eventually doing so. DeGeneres, who is gay and who had built part of her public identity around advocacy for LGBTQ inclusion, invited Hart onto her show in early 2019. She told him on air that she had spoken with the Academy on his behalf and encouraged him to consider taking the hosting job back. She framed it as a gesture of forgiveness and inclusion, one member of a marginalized community extending grace to someone who had caused impact to that community. The response from LGBTQ advocacy groups and commentators was pointed. The criticism wasn't aimed at the idea of forgiveness, it was aimed at the specific dynamic. DeGeneres, as an openly gay woman with an enormous platform, had effectively used that platform to advocate for a man who had made homophobic jokes, without appearing to center the perspectives of the people those jokes had actually affected. Several writers and commentators noted that it felt less like an act of community and more like a celebrity using their credibility to smooth over a controversy for a colleague. The situation put DeGeneres in an unusual position for someone whose brand was built on progressive values. She was being criticized not from the right, but from within the community she was understood to represent. The criticism was substantive, and it didn't fully go away. Hedging on kindness, the George W. Bush moment. In October of 2019, a photograph circulated of Ellen DeGeneres sitting next to former President George W. Bush at a Dallas Cowboys football game. The two appeared to be enjoying themselves. The image sparked immediate and significant conversation, given Bush's record on same-sex marriage and LGBTQ rights during his administration. DeGeneres addressed it directly on her show the following week. She made the case that she could be friends with people whose views differed from her own, that kindness didn't require agreement, and that sitting next to someone at a football game wasn't an endorsement of their politics. The message was framed as a call for civility across political differences. The pushback was immediate and came from multiple directions. Critics pointed out that Bush's policies hadn't simply been a matter of differing opinions, they had had direct, material consequences for gay and lesbian Americans. For many in the LGBTQ community, the framing of anti-gay policy as a mere difference of perspective was itself the problem. Kindness, they argued, was easier to practice when you hadn't been the target. What the moment revealed was a tension that had been present in DeGeneres' public persona for a long time, between the universal, feel-good version of kindness she promoted on air and the more complicated realities of what kindness actually requires when the stakes are unequal. The Bush moment didn't ruin her reputation on its own, but it added to a growing sense that the brand and the reality didn't always line up. What it all adds up to. Here's the thing about everything that's been covered here. None of it, individually, is enough to explain why so many people in Hollywood started quietly keeping their distance from Ellen DeGeneres. But together, they point to something consistent. The workplace investigation revealed a culture built around image management as much as actual kindness. The Mariah Carey moment showed what happened when a guest's privacy conflicted with good television. The Dakota Johnson exchange showed what happened when someone simply refused to be managed. The Kevin Hart situation showed how the kindness brand could be deployed in ways that served some people more than others. The George W. Bush moment showed how that same brand could smooth over things that probably deserved more friction. What celebrities who had been around DeGeneres long enough seemed to understand, before the general public caught up, was that the version of her on camera and the version of her off camera weren't always the same person. And in an industry where reputation is currency, that gap eventually becomes its own kind of story. DeGeneres announced in May of 2021 that The Ellen DeGeneres Show would end after its 19th season, which concluded in 2022. She described the decision as a creative one, that the show had run its natural course. Whether or not that was the complete picture, it marked the end of nearly 2 decades of daytime television that had, depending on who you asked, either been exactly what it appeared to be or something considerably more complicated. The celebrities who kept their distance weren't wrong. They just knew earlier than most. Here's what actually makes this story stick. Most of us have met this person, not on television, in real life. The one who leads with kindness loudly enough that questioning them feels mean. The one where the reputation does the work of protecting them long before anyone looks closely. Ellen DeGeneres had 20 years and a television show. Most people doing the same thing just have a workplace. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel. For more interesting stories like this, be sure to click on the next video that pops up on your screen. You never know what you'll discover next.